I had 24 hours to find a wife, and the last woman in the city I expected to volunteer was the one everyone called the Winter Widow. The morning it started, I was elbow-deep in flour, running the same column of numbers for the 9th time because I didn't trust myself to be right the first 8. Bellwether Bakery opened at 6. I'd been there since 4, proofing dough with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, though that had less to do with the cold ovens and more to do with the manila envelope sitting on the counter like it might detonate. My grandmother had been dead 6 weeks. The lawyer's office had called it a reading of final provisions, which was a polite way of saying that at 9 o'clock that morning, my whole life would be decided by a woman who could no longer defend the decision. My name is Josephine Calder. I was 29 years and 364 days old, an omega who had never fully presented, no heat cycle worth naming, no scent strong enough to register on most people, a designation the family doctor once described, in front of my mother, as underdeveloped. My aunts called me practical. My uncle called me a waste of a dowry. I called myself the only person in this family who could still read a balance sheet, which was true, and which nobody wanted to hear. The bell over the bakery door had cracked the day of my grandmother's funeral. Nobody had touched it since. It used to ring bright and clean every time someone came in. Now it made a flat, apologetic clink, like something with a broken rib trying to still do its job. I kept meaning to replace it. I kept not being able to afford it. At 9, my Uncle Harold arrived with the lawyer and my cousin Dana, and by 9:06 I understood why my grandmother had waited until she was dying to tell any of us the terms. The bakery and the apartment above it passed to me, Hurwell said, on the condition that I was legally married by midnight on my 30th birthday. If I was not, the property reverted in full to Harold Calder, my father's brother, who had power of attorney over the estate in the interim, and who had, as it turned out, already signed a letter of intent with a development company 2 weeks before the reading. 24 hours. That was the gap between the woman my grandmother had raised and the empty lot Harold had already priced out. She always did like her theater, Harold said, folding the letter closed like he was doing me a favor by not reading the number out loud. Josie, sweetheart, who exactly do you think is marrying you by midnight? Donna laughed into her coffee, not loudly, just enough. I stood there with flour on my wrists and my grandmother's ring loose on a chain under my shirt, and I did the thing I always do instead of crying, which is math. If Harold took the building, the redevelopment company would break ground within the year. My sister Wren, 17, in and out of dialysis twice a week, lived in the apartment upstairs because it was 5 minutes from the clinic, and because I could hear her through the floor if something went wrong at 3 in the morning. There was no version of losing this building that didn't mean losing that. She's not wrong to laugh, Harold said, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. No offense, Josie, you're a good worker, but a wife by midnight isn't a checking account you can just balance. That was when I noticed the ledger in his lawyer's folder didn't match the ledger in mine. Small thing. A transposed number in the estate's liquid assets, $4,000, that existed on Harold's copy and didn't exist on the one my grandmother had kept in her own hand. I almost said something. I didn't, not yet, because a voice from the back corner of the bakery said it for me. Say that again. Every head in the room turned. I hadn't even registered that anyone was sitting back there. A woman at the corner table, dark coat, a coffee she hadn't touched, still and quiet in the way furniture is quiet, which should have told me something, because furniture doesn't have a scent like cold stone and juniper smoke that made the hair on my arms lift from across the room. I said, Harold repeated, uncertain now, that it isn't realistic. I wasn't talking to you. The woman stood. She wasn't tall in a way that should have filled a room, but the room filled itself around her anyway, the way water finds the low point without being told to. I was talking to her ledger. It's off by $4,000 from yours. Which of you would like to explain that to the city? She said it the way other people say good morning. Harold's face did something complicated. Dana's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. I don't believe we've met, Harold said. No, the woman agreed. You wouldn't have. I don't do business with men who steal from dead women. She looked at me for the first time, and I felt it land somewhere under my sternum, a pressure like a held breath. You need a wife by midnight. It wasn't a question. I answered it like one anyway, because my mouth had apparently stopped consulting my brain. Yes, then I'll marry you, said the winter widow, and the bell over the door, cracked as it was, seemed to hold its breath along with everyone else in the room. I want to be honest about what I knew of her before that morning, because it wasn't nothing. Everyone in Harrow Docks knew the name Corvain the way you know weather, something that happened to you, not something you argued with. Vesper Corvain ran the shipping company that ran the docks that ran, depending on who you asked in a low enough voice, half the things that moved through this city after dark. Her wife had been murdered 5 years ago, they said, and she had not smiled in public since. The press called her cold. The neighborhood called her worse, in tones that were half fear and half something closer to prayer, the way you'd talk about weather that had, on occasion, spared your house. She was not what I expected up close. Not the ice the rumors promised, something colder than that, more exact, like a held note. Her eyes were the gray of a sky before snow, and when she looked at the estate ledgers still open on the counter, she didn't look at them the way a stranger looks at someone else's math. She looked at them the way you look at a door you already know how to open. You don't know me, I said, which was the only true thing I could produce. No, she agreed again, but I know theft when I smell it, and I know your grandmother's bread better than most people in this city, because I used to buy it every Sunday for 6 years before she died. Something passed over her face, brief as a shadow underwater. I'm not offering you a marriage, Miss Calder. I'm offering you a contract with a ring on it. You keep your building. Your sister keeps her home. And your uncle explains $4,000 to a judge instead of a wedding registry. She glanced at the clock above the register. 9:40. You have 14 hours before the courthouse closes. I'd use them. Harold started to say something about impropriety, about a stranger, about the family name, and Dana started to say something about how convenient it all was, and I stood in the middle of my grandmother's bakery with flour drying on my forearms and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes right before you do something irreversible, that I was about to marry a woman whose scent I could not stop noticing, and whose name made grown men lower their voices. Okay, I said. The winter widow, Vesper, held out her hand like we were closing a business deal, which I would come to understand was exactly what she believed we were doing. I shook it. Her hand was warm. I hadn't expected that. Bring your sister, she said. And your ledgers. Both of them. She was already moving toward the door, coat settling around her like something deciding to be still. We have a lot to do before midnight, Miss Calder, and I don't like to be late for my own weddings. It was the first time I heard her joke. I didn't know yet that it was one. The courthouse annex on Barlow Street closes its marriage license window at 11 at night on weekdays, a fact I only knew because I'd looked it up twice in the hour after Vesper Corvain left the bakery, my heart doing something arrhythmic and undignified. She'd given me an address instead of a time, a black glass building on the edge of Harrow Docks with no sign on the door, just a number, 14, brushed steel and unapologetic, and told me to bring Wren. Wren, for her part, took the entire event with the calm of a girl who had already survived worse things than a stranger proposing to her sister in a bakery. "She smells like a storm that's already happened," Wren said in the car, which I filed away as either the most accurate thing anyone had said all day or evidence that dialysis made her poetic. "Also, she's terrifying. Also, I like her." The building's lobby had floors that reflected the ceiling lights like water, and a security desk manned by a woman who didn't ask us for ID, only looked at me for 2 full seconds and said, "You're the one from the bakery," before waving us through like the words were a password. Vesper met us at the elevator. She'd changed out of the dark coat into something equally dark but sharper, and up close, without a room full of witnesses to perform for, she looked less like a headline and more like someone who hadn't slept properly in longer than she'd admit. "You brought the ledgers," she said, nodding at the folder under my arm, and there was something like approval in it. "You said to. Most people would have brought a lawyer instead." She held the elevator door. "I like that you didn't." Upstairs was a floor of glass offices and one boardroom, with a table long enough to seat 20, currently occupied by exactly 2 people, a broad-shouldered man leaning against the window with his arms crossed, watching me with an expression I would later learn to recognize as professional suspicion, and an older woman setting out tea like the building's entire criminal reputation was background noise to her afternoon schedule. "Bram Solis," the man said, not moving from the window. Vesper's second. He didn't offer his hand. "You understand what you're walking into." "I understand I'm walking out of losing my sister's home," I said. "The rest I'm learning as I go." Something flickered across his face. Not quite approval, but not the dismissal I expected either. Vesper, crossing to the table, didn't look at him. "Bram doesn't warm to people quickly," she said. "Don't take it personally. He didn't warm to me for the first 2 years either. That's because you set my car on fire," Bram said. "That was an accident." "You told me it wasn't. I was younger and needed the reputation." Vesper pulled out a chair, and this was the part that undid something in my chest, small and quiet, pulled out a second one across from it for me. "Miss Calder, before we do anything with a judge, I want to see the ledgers." Both of them, side by side. I laid them out. I'd been staring at the discrepancy since 9 that morning, and I still couldn't have told you, in that first minute, what had made the shape of it wrong. But watching Vesper's eyes move down the columns, I understood I wasn't the only one who read numbers like a language instead of a chore. "Your uncle's copy shows a transfer to an escrow account 11 days before your grandmother died," she said. "Your grandmother's copy doesn't. Either she forgot to log $4,000, which doesn't match a woman who balanced her books to the penny for 40 years, or he moved money out of the estate before she was even gone," I finished, and backdated the paperwork to make it look authorized. Vesper looked up at me, and for the first time since the bakery, something in her face wasn't careful. It was close to delight. "You caught this in one morning. I've been keeping her books since I was 19. I know what her handwriting does when the numbers are true." I closed the folder, my hands finally steady. This isn't the first thing he's taken. It's just the first thing I could prove. "Bram," Vesper said, not raising her voice, "get someone on the escrow account by morning." "Already texting," Bram said. "Phone out." The old woman with the tea, Agatha, I'd learn, set a cup in front of me without asking if I wanted one. The way you do for someone you've already decided belongs in the room. "She's got her grandmother's hands," Agatha said to no one in particular, which made no sense and also somehow made me want to cry for the first time all day. We were married at 11:40 that night by a judge Vesper knew personally, in a room with fluorescent lighting and 2 witnesses, Bram, arms still crossed, and Agatha dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she produced from nowhere. Wren stood beside me in her school hoodie, ivy bruise still yellowing on the inside of her elbow, grinning like this was the best television she'd ever watched live. "Do you?" Josephine called her. "Take Vesper Corvain, I do," I said, 20 minutes before midnight, before the judge had even finished the sentence, because some part of me was terrified the clock would win if I waited for the whole question. Vesper's mouth did something at the corner that wasn't quite a smile. "Eager," she murmured, low enough that only I heard it, and reached for my hand. Her palm was warm again. I noticed, this time, that mine wasn't shaking. "I do," she said, when it was her turn, and she said it like a woman closing a door she intended to stand in front of for the rest of her life. The scent hit me for the second time that day when she signed the certificate, juniper smoke and something like river stone after rain, cold and clean and entirely hers. And beneath it, when I signed my own name beside hers, I caught my own scent rising for the first time in longer than I could remember, warm and sweet, burnt sugar and flour, like the ovens had finally decided I was worth registering. "Welcome home, Mrs. Corvain," Agatha said, and Bram, against every prediction I'd made about him in the last 2 hours, actually smiled. I didn't correct the name. I found, standing in that fluorescent room 3 minutes before midnight, that I didn't want to. The compound, because that was the only honest word for it, though Vesper called it the house with a straight face that made Bram roll his eyes every time, sat behind a gate on the bluff above Harrow Docks, close enough to the water that I could hear the foghorns at night, and far enough from everything I knew that the first morning I woke there, I lay still for a full minute trying to place the ceiling. Wren got a room with a view of the harbor and a nurse on retainer within 18 hours of the wedding, which was the moment I understood exactly how much power I'd married into. I got a room 3 doors down from Vesper's, not the same room, a detail I noticed and didn't examine too closely, with a closet full of clothes in my size that nobody would admit to ordering, and a desk already stocked with the kind of accounting software I'd only ever used on borrowed licenses at the library. "It's a marriage of convenience," Vesper told me on the second morning. Over coffee she made herself, badly, in a kitchen big enough to feed 40, and clearly unused to being touched by its owner. "I want to be clear about the terms. You keep the bakery. Your sister keeps her care. In exchange, my name protects you, and in 6 months, if you want out, I'll make the divorce as painless as the wedding was fast." She said it like a woman reading a contract she'd already memorized, and something in my chest unreasonably deflated. "And if I don't want out in 6 months?" I asked, mostly to see what she'd do with it. She didn't answer right away. She looked at me instead, longer than the question required, gray eyes doing the same close reading she'd done on my grandmother's ledger. "Then we'll discuss it in 6 months, she said finally, which wasn't a no. The estate staff were polite to my face and less careful behind my back. I heard the word charity more than once in the first week, always from the same direction, a man named Marcus Teague, Vesper's second cousin and the head of the company's shipping contracts, who had a way of saying Mrs. Corvain that put ice water down my spine even before I understood why. "She'll last a season," I heard him tell someone in the hallway outside the study, not troubling to lower his voice much. "Boss has a soft spot for strays. Had one before, if you'll recall." I didn't ask who he meant. I didn't have to. There was a room on the 3rd floor that nobody used, door always shut, and once, walking past it at 2 in the morning because Wren's dialysis schedule had my sleep permanently disordered, I found Vesper standing in the doorway of it with her hand flat against the frame like she was checking a pulse. She didn't see me. I didn't let her. I went back to bed and didn't ask, because some doors you don't knock on until you're invited. What I could do, what I was good at, what nobody in that house yet knew I was good at, beyond the one ledger in the boardroom, was numbers. So on the fourth day, when Bram came to the kitchen looking for Vesper and found me instead, hunched over the Harbor Authority's public shipping manifests, I'd pulled up out of pure restless habit, cross-referencing them against the dates on Harold's estate paperwork. Because old Muscle didn't stop moving just because the crisis had passed, he stood in the doorway for a long moment before he spoke. "That a hobby," he said. "Or are you actually finding something?" "I'm finding your uncle's shell company," I said, not looking up. "Sorry, her cousins. I keep doing that." I turned the laptop around. Teague Logistics Solutions. Registered 8 months ago. Files invoices with the Corvain shipping division for cargo weight that doesn't match the manifests filed with the Harbor Authority 24 hours later. Somebody's charging for freight that isn't on the boat. Bram went very still. "How much?" "I've only got 3 months of data. Call it 60,000, conservative. If it's been running longer, more." I finally looked up at him. "I'm not trying to start something. I saw a discrepancy. It's what I do. Don't apologize for it," he said, and for the first time since I'd met him, his voice had lost its edge. In 15 years, I have never once seen her let anybody pass the front gate this fast, let alone hand them a marriage certificate. "She's not sentimental, Mrs. Corvain. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." He nodded at the laptop. "Show her tonight. Not before staff, just her." He left before I could ask him what exactly it was I was doing, because I genuinely didn't know yet. I only knew that when Vesper found me in the kitchen that evening, coat still on, tired in a way that made her look younger and less like a headline, and I turned the laptop toward her the way I had toward Bram, she went quiet for almost a full minute reading it. And then she looked up at me with an expression I hadn't earned yet and didn't fully understand. "You did this in 4 days," she said. "I had insomnia and a spreadsheet. It wasn't hard. It's very hard," she said. "You're just good at it." She closed the laptop gently, like it deserved care, and something in the set of her shoulders had changed. Not relief, not yet, but the specific alertness of someone who has just found the shape of a threat they'd only felt before as pressure. "Marcus filed those invoices." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." I know his handwriting even in spreadsheet form. She was quiet again, and when she spoke this time, her voice had dropped, careful in a way that made the hair on my arms lift. "I need you to keep this between us for now. Can you do that? I married you at 11:40 at night to save my sister's home," I said. "I think I can manage a secret." That got the smallest real smile I'd seen from her yet, there and gone, like a light passing under a door, before her phone buzzed and her face closed back into the version the city knew. She read the message, and whatever was in it took the smile the rest of the way with it. "Pharaoh's making a move on the West Pier," she said, mostly to herself. Tonight, she looked at me, and the alertness sharpened into something colder. "Stay in the house, whatever you hear, whatever you see out that window. Stay inside." She was gone before I could ask what I might see. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window in my borrowed room with the lights off, watching the harbor lights strobe blue and red somewhere past the tree line, and I thought about a locked room on the 3rd floor, and a name, Elena, that Agatha had let slip once while dusting a photograph she then quickly turned face down, and a woman who ran her thumb across her own knuckles when she thought no one was watching, like she was checking old scars were still closed. It was almost dawn when I finally understood the shape of what I'd married into, and by then it was already too late to be careful about it. Agatha told me about Elena 3 days later, not because I asked, but because grief, unlike most secrets in that house, wanted to be spoken. We were in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, both of us early risers for different reasons, mine insomnia, hers habit, and she was teaching me, unprompted, how Vesper liked her coffee, which turned out to be the only domestic thing about that woman that wasn't complicated. Black, no sugar. Too hot to drink for the first 5 minutes, which she never waited for. Elena used to make her wait, Agatha said, apropos of nothing, setting the kettle down. Used to physically hold the cup back from her. Vesper let her. Vesper doesn't let anyone tell her no about anything else in this world, but she'd let that girl hold a coffee cup hostage and laugh about it. She smiled at the memory, and then the smile folded in on itself. 5 years ago, March, they took her on the docks. Pharaoh's men, though nobody's ever proven it in a courtroom that mattered. Vesper was 11 minutes away. 11 minutes, I repeated, and understood, with a lurch, why time was counted so precisely in that house. Why Vesper checked her phone the way other people check a pulse. She doesn't talk about it, Agatha said. Her mother raised her on the idea that control is the only mercy you owe anybody. Miriam Corvain, God rest her, ran this family like a ledger with no room for error. Vesper believed her, mostly, until Elena taught her different. And then Elena died, and Vesper decided her mother had been right all along. Control, nothing else. She spent 5 years making sure nothing gets close enough to prove her wrong again. Agatha looked at me over the rim of her own cup, steady and assessing. Until a bakery, apparently, I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing, and Agatha, satisfied that the seed was planted, went back to teaching me the coffee. I found Vesper an hour later in the study, papers from the previous night's peer confrontation spread across the desk. Nothing about Pharaoh directly, I noticed, but shipping logs, the same kind I'd been cross-referencing all week, now with red circles in her own hand around 3 separate entries. You found the same pattern I did, I said, before I could stop myself. She didn't look up. I found it 2 years ago. I never had proof. She tapped one of the circled lines. This is the 3rd time in 6 months cargo's gone missing between manifest and delivery. Every time, it routes through a birthmark's controls. You think it's him. I think, she said, finally lifting her eyes to mine, that I have spent 2 years telling myself it couldn't be, because he's family, and my mother taught me that family doesn't do this. And then I married a stranger from a bakery who found the same hole in 4 days that I couldn't let myself see in 2 years. Something moved behind her eyes, not quite anger, closer to grief wearing anger's coat. I don't like what that says about me. It says you loved somebody enough to not want to look, I said. That's not the same as being careless. She was quiet for a long moment, studying me the way she'd studied the ledgers that first morning, like I was a column that wasn't adding up the way she expected, and she was starting, cautiously, to enjoy that. Agatha told you, she said. Not a question. She told me about Elena. And what do you think, now that you know? I think 11 minutes is a terrible number to carry around, I said. And I think you've spent 5 years punishing yourself for math you didn't control. She stood up so fast the chair scraped against the floor, and for a second I thought I'd overstepped in some unforgivable way, and then I realized she wasn't retreating. She'd crossed the space between us instead, close enough that the juniper and stone of her filled the air I was breathing, close enough that I could see the exact gray of her eyes wasn't flat at all. It had weather in it. Tell me to stop, she said, low, and I will. I didn't tell her to stop. I said, don't. And she kissed me like a woman closing a door she'd sworn she'd never open again, careful even in the wanting of it, one hand at my jaw like she was afraid of pressing too hard on something that might break. It didn't last long. A door somewhere in the house banged, Footsteps. Bram's voice calling her name with an edge that cut straight through whatever had just started between us, and Vesper pulled back with her forehead still resting against mine for one more second before she answered him, professional and cold and already someone else again. Later she said to me, so quiet it barely qualified as sound. Then, louder, to the door. What? Ren's asking for Joe, Bram said, out of breath. Clinic called. Something's wrong with her numbers. I was already moving before he finished the sentence, and Vesper was one step behind me, and whatever had almost happened in that study got folded away, unfinished, for later. The clinic said Ren's potassium had spiked overnight, not an emergency, the doctor assured us twice, but enough to keep her 3 days for monitoring, enough to make me sit in a beige hallway at 9 a.m. with my hands shaking again for a different reason than a courthouse deadline. Vesper sat beside me the entire 3 days. She rearranged 2 shipping negotiations and 1 meeting with a councilman to do it, a fact I only learned later from Bram, delivered like evidence in a case he was quietly building on her behalf. She doesn't sit in hospital hallways, he told me on the second day, handing me a coffee that was, unmistakably, made the way Vesper liked hers, black, too hot. Not since Elena's funeral. She's been in this one for 2 days straight. I didn't ask her to. I know, Bram said. That's the part that matters. On the 3rd night, with Ren finally stable and asleep, and the machines around her beeping in their steady, uneventful rhythm, Vesper told me about the scar. We were in the family lounge down the hall, the kind of beige room built for exactly this, waiting, badly, together, and she'd rolled her sleeve back without ceremony, showing me a thin white line along her forearm I hadn't noticed before. The kind of scar that had healed clean because someone competent had stitched it. The night Elena died, she said, watching the wall instead of me. I got there in time to see them leaving. I got this trying to stop them. It didn't work. I've never told anyone what it's from, because everyone assumes it's something more dramatic. It isn't. It's just proof I was 11 minutes and 1 bad decision away, and I've carried it so I'd never let myself forget the cost of being slow. I reached over and put 2 fingers against the scar, light, asking permission with the touch before I said anything with words. She let me. You weren't slow, I said. You were 11 minutes away from a plan somebody else made. That's not the same thing. My mother would say control means there is no difference. Her voice had gone rough at the edges. Control means accounting for every variable. I didn't account for Marcus. I didn't account for the fact that loving someone means you can't control the whole world around them, no matter how careful you are. She finally looked at me, and there was something unguarded in it that hadn't been there in the study, something that had waited 3 days in a hospital hallway to arrive. I told myself I would never again let anyone close enough to matter, because mattering is where the 11 minutes live. And then a woman with flour on her wrists caught a stolen $4,000 in one morning, and I have not had a controlled thought about anything since. That's the least romantic confession I've ever heard, I said, mostly to keep from crying, and somehow it's still the best one. She laughed. Actually laughed, short and startled, like the sound had escaped before she'd approved it, and it undid something in me more thoroughly than the kiss in the study had. I don't make promises I can't keep, she said. Quieter now? Serious again, so I'm only going to make you one. Nobody touches your sister. Nobody touches that bakery. Nobody touches you. Not while I'm breathing. That's a big promise for a marriage of convenience, I said. Yes, she agreed, and didn't take it back. We brought Ren home on the 4th morning, and for 2 weeks after that, something in the house softened that I hadn't realized was rigid until it wasn't. Vesper started coming to the kitchen before staff arrived, badly making coffee we both pretended tasted fine. The bell from the bakery, I'd mentioned it once, in passing, complaining about its cracked, apologetic clink, disappeared from the shop one afternoon and reappeared 2 weeks later on the compound's workbench, disassembled. A note in Agatha's hand that said the metalsmith needed another 10 days. I didn't ask Vesper if she'd arranged it. I already knew. It ended on a Tuesday, the way most good things in that house seemed to, with a phone ringing at 8 in the morning while Vesper and I were still at the kitchen table, her reading shipping contracts, me cross-referencing them without being asked, because some habits are just how I show up for people now. Bram's voice on the other end was flat, in a way I'd learned meant something had already gone badly wrong. "Wren's not answering," he said. "Nurse says she left for her morning walk 40 minutes ago. She's not on the grounds." The coffee cup Vesper had been holding hit the table hard enough to crack. The security footage, when Bram pulled it up 20 minutes later in the study, showed exactly 4 seconds of my sister, walking the garden path she walked every morning, headphones in, hood up against the harbor wind, before a dark van entered frame from the service gate and the feed cut to static, clean and immediate. The kind of interruption that doesn't happen by accident. "Someone killed the camera loop on purpose," Bram said. "Whoever did this had the gate codes." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I stood in the study with my hands flat on the desk, the same desk where Vesper had kissed me 2 weeks ago like a door opening, and watched 4 seconds of my sister's last free steps loop over and over, while my whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with any designation. "The gate codes rotate weekly," Vesper said, very quietly, very evenly, in a voice I recognized now as the sound she made right before something in her broke. 6 people have them. Myself, Bram, Agatha, head of security, and Marcus, I finished. Her phone buzzed before either of us could say more. A text, no name attached, forwarded from an unknown number to a burner Bram kept for exactly this kind of message. A photograph of Wren, hood down now, sitting on a metal folding chair in a room I didn't recognize, expression carefully blank in the specific way she went blank when she was terrified and refusing to show it. Beneath the photo, 3 lines of text. "Tell your accountant wife to stop reading my books. You have until sundown to hand over the shipping ledgers she copied, and to announce, publicly, that Corvain Logistics is under new leadership as of tonight, or the girl goes in the harbor the way Elena did. Your choice, Vesper. Make it fast this time." The room went very still. I watched something close over Vesper's face, not the coldness the city knew, something worse, something with no bottom to it, and understood, in the space of one held breath, that I was watching the exact moment a woman who had spent 5 years building walls around herself decided, quietly and completely, to tear every one of them down for my sister's sake. "Get the car," Vesper said to Bram, and her voice had gone somewhere I hadn't heard it go before, somewhere past cold, into a register with no mercy left in it at all. "And get me Marcus Teague's location. Now." I found my own voice somewhere underneath the roaring in my ears. "Vesper," she looked at me, and for just a second the wall cracked enough that I saw the 11 minutes in her eyes, the whole 5 years of them, superimposed over the metal folding chair in that photograph. "I promised you," she said, "nobody touches her. I intend to keep that promise even if it costs me everything I've built." "Then let me help you keep it right," I said. "Because if you go in there and kill him, Vesper, we lose the ledgers, we lose the proof, and Marcus's whole crew still thinks the truth died with him. I can trace where that van went. I've been living in these shipping logs for 2 weeks. Give me 20 minutes before you give me your worst instincts. She stared at me for a long moment, long enough that Bram, halfway to the door, stopped and waited too. And then something in her shoulders dropped. Not defeat. Recalibration. The specific look of a woman choosing to trust a plan that wasn't purely her own for the first time in 5 years. 20 minutes, she said. Then, we go. I sat down at the desk, pulled up the manifests, and started counting the seconds. I found the warehouse in 14 minutes, not 20, because grief makes you fast in ways patience never does. Marcus's shell company had filed a lease 8 months ago on a berth-adjacent property on the east side of the docks, Pier 9, Cargo Bay 4, the same berth that had shown up circled in red on Vesper's desk 2 weeks before, the same berth I'd flagged in my own spreadsheet on the 4th night in that house. He'd been hiding in plain sight inside his own fraud the entire time. He's not smart, I said, turning the laptop toward Vesper and Bram in the back of the car, already moving. He's greedy, and he's angry that you got the company instead of him, and angry people build patterns. This is his pattern. That's not comforting, Bram said, checking a gun I hadn't noticed him carrying until that moment. It wasn't meant to be comforting, it was meant to be right. I looked at Vesper, who hadn't said a word since we'd gotten in the car, jaw set, hands perfectly still in her lap, in a way that was somehow more frightening than if they'd been shaking. I need you to hear me say this once. When we get there, when you see her, I know what you want to do to him. I understand why. But if you kill Marcus Teague in that warehouse, every question about who was really stealing from this company dies with him. And every person in your organization who's ever doubted you gets a legend about what you did in the dark instead of proof of what you're worth in the light. Let me build the case. Let the truth kill him instead of your hands. Vesper's eyes finally moved to mine. Whatever she found there, and I don't fully know what it was, only that I meant every word of it with a ferocity that surprised even me. Something in her settled, marginally, like a held breath finally exhaled through gritted teeth. You married a very dangerous woman for a bakery, she said. Lo, I married a woman who kept a promise, I said. I'm asking her to keep the next part of it smart. The warehouse door came off its hinges 11 minutes later. Bram's doing, not subtle, never meant to be. And inside, in the flat fluorescent wash of an unheated cargo bay, I saw my sister exactly as the photo had shown her, upright, defiant, hood back down, glaring at the man pacing in front of her like she was more furious than afraid, which, God help her, was exactly like Wren. Marcus Teague turned toward the noise with a gun already half raised, and Vesper crossed the distance between the door and him faster than I could track, faster than Bram could cover, and the gunshot that followed didn't come from Marcus's weapon. It came from behind a stack of shipping crates, a second man I hadn't accounted for, and it caught Vesper high in the shoulder as she threw herself between the barrel and where Wren sat chained to the chair. She didn't fall. She staggered, one hand flying to the wound, blood already dark through juniper dark fabric, and she was still standing between my sister and Marcus Teague when Bram put the second gunman down. With 2 shots, I felt more than heard. I don't remember crossing the floor. I remember Marcus's face when he understood the warehouse was no longer his, the specific ugly collapse of a man who had built his entire plan on nobody being smart enough to trace him, on his cousin being too controlled to move fast, on nobody loving anybody enough in that family to break either of their patterns at once. I remember Vesper's hand, bloody, closing hard around his collar, dragging him up off his knees with a strength that shouldn't have been possible when armed and bleeding. Vesper, I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. Don't. He's not worth what it costs you. Her eyes were black with something I recognize now, the 11 minutes, the 5 years, all of it rising at once behind her face. And then she looked at me, at Ren shaking but unhurt in the chair behind her, and something in the black receded, not gone, just chosen against. "Cuff him," she said to Bram, releasing Marcus so abruptly the man crumpled. Alive, every ledger, every wire transfer, every witness. We do this in front of the whole company, in the light where everyone sees exactly what he is. Her legs finally buckled, and I caught her before she went all the way down, her blood warm against my hands, her scent gone strange and sour with pain in a way that terrified me more than the gun had. "You're bleeding," I said, stupidly, because apparently that was the only sentence left in me. "You're right," Vesper said, and even bleeding out on a warehouse floor, she managed to sound faintly amused. "Ledger, I believe you promised me 20 minutes and a plan. I'd like to see the rest of it." "After the hospital," I said, and held on to her the entire way there. The council room at Corvain Shipping had never, as far as Bram told me afterward, been used for anything but quarterly reports and the occasional funeral. It seated 40. On the night of the reckoning, every seat was full, and people stood along the back wall 3 deep, captains, dockhands, accountants, the whole apparatus of an empire gathered under one roof because word had traveled through Harrow Docks the way it always does, fast and half true, and everyone wanted to see for themselves which half was real. Vesper stood at the head of the table with her arm in a sling, refusing, against every doctor's advice, to sit down for this. I stood beside her with a folder 3 inches thick, the whole story laid out in numbers, because numbers, I had learned in that house, were the only language nobody in that room could argue with. 8 months ago, I said, and my voice only shook for the first sentence, Marcus Teague registered a shell logistics company under a variation of his own name, and began overbilling this organization for cargo weight that never existed. $61,000 in the first quarter alone. By month 6, when the pattern grew too obvious to keep hidden inside legitimate freight, he began diverting real product to a rival buyer, falsifying the manifests to cover the loss, and using the proceeds to fund an arrangement with the Farrow family that he believed would put him in this chair instead of the woman standing next to me. I laid the pages out one at a time, slow, deliberate, letting the room see each number land. When his cousin's new wife found the first discrepancy in 4 days, what he'd spent 2 years hiding, he panicked and kidnapped a 17-year-old girl with a kidney condition to try to buy himself more time. That's not a business dispute. That's not family loyalty gone wrong. That's a man who decided greed was worth more than every person in this room who trusted him. Marcus, seated in a chair at the far end with 2 of Bram's people flanking him, said nothing. He'd said plenty in the warehouse. He had nothing left now, in front of the only jury that had ever mattered to him. "I built this company on the idea that family means something," Vesper said, and her voice carried to the back wall without needing to rise. "My mother taught me that control was the only mercy worth offering anyone." I believed her for a long time, because it was easier than believing love could survive in a business like this one. She looked, briefly, at me, and something passed across the room like weather changing. I was wrong about the mercy. I wasn't wrong that this family is built on trust, and Marcus broke it in every direction a man can break it. He's finished here. He goes to the authorities with every piece of evidence my wife assembled, and if the Farrow family wants to claim him, they're welcome to whatever's left. There was a silence after that, not shocked, not uncertain. The particular silence of a room recalibrating its loyalty in real time, and then, from the back, an old dockhand I didn't recognize started to clap, slow at first, and it spread through the room like the bell finally finding its ring again. Uncle Harold's reckoning came 3 days later, quieter, in a courtroom instead of a warehouse, when the same forensic thread I'd pulled on Marcus's shell company turned out to run, 18 months back, straight through an escrow account he'd opened using power of attorney he'd been granted before my grandmother died and never should have used the way he did. Fraud on an elder's estate carries its own kind of sentence. Donna, who had laughed into her coffee the morning it started, lost her share of an inheritance that no longer existed to lose. And lost, too, whatever standing she'd had in a family that had just watched her mock the one member of it who turned out to be the smartest person in every room she'd ever sneered in. I didn't feel triumphant watching either reckoning land. I felt, mostly, like a woman finally exhaling a breath she'd been holding since she was 19 years old and learned to read a ledger because nobody else in her family could be trusted to. Vesper found me on the compound's back terrace that night, harbor lights strung out below us like something spilled and glittering, her arm still in its sling, a small velvet box in her free hand that she held out without any of the ceremony I'd have expected from a woman who ran an empire. "We're already married," I said, looking at it. "You proposing to your own wife? I married a stranger from a bakery to save a building," Vesper said. "I'd like to marry the woman standing in front of me now for reasons that have nothing to do with contracts." She opened the box. Inside was a ring, plain, silver. Nothing like the diamonds I'd have expected from a woman with her resources, and set into the band, small enough you'd miss it if you weren't looking. A fragment of brass, polished smooth. "It's from the old bell," she said. "The metalsmith couldn't save the whole thing." I asked him to save this. I didn't have words for a long moment, which, for me, is rare enough to notice. "Tell me to stop," I finally said, echoing her own words back to her. "And I will." "Don't," Vesper said, and I understood, watching her face in the harbor light, that I had married the coldest woman in the city and found, underneath every layer the world had built around her, someone who had simply been waiting 5 years for a reason to stop being careful. She kissed me there on the terrace, careful of her shoulder and careless of everything else, and when she finally drew back, she pressed her mouth to the curve of my throat, over the place where a claiming mark would sit if I said the word. "Ask me," I said, "with your words. I want to hear you ask." "Josephine Calder," Vesper said against my skin, "will you let me claim you the way I should have claimed the first thing in 5 years that made me want to?" "Yes," I said, and didn't have to say it twice. The bite, when it came, was gentle in a way I hadn't expected from a woman capable of the things I'd watched her do in a warehouse 3 days before. A slow, deliberate pressure, more promise than pain, and the bond that opened afterward hit me like the first true breath after being underwater. I felt her relief through it before I heard her say it out loud. I felt, underneath the relief, 5 years of grief finally setting something down. "Nobody touches this shop while I'm breathing," she murmured against the new mark, and I understood, finally, that she wasn't only talking about the bakery anymore. The wedding, the real one, the one neither of us needed for a courthouse deadline, happened 7 months later in the reopened Bellwether Bakery, flour dust still faintly visible in the corners, no matter how many times Agatha insisted on cleaning it, because some things, we'd decided, were allowed to stay imperfect. Ren stood beside me as my witness, off dialysis for 4 months by then, thanks to a donor match Vesper's resources had located faster than any waiting list could have managed, grinning through the whole ceremony like she'd personally arranged the entire love story herself, which, by her account, she basically had. Bram stood beside Vesper, stiff in a suit he clearly hated, and when the judge, the same one from the courthouse, requested specially, Asked if anyone objected, he said, loud enough for the whole shop to hear. In 15 years, I have never once seen her wait for anyone. She's not waiting now. Get on with it, which made the whole room laugh and made Vesper, for the first time in public that I'd witnessed, laugh along with them. Our vows were short. Vesper had never been a woman for excess words, and I'd learned in 7 months of marriage that her shortest sentences carried the most weight. I spent 5 years believing control was the only mercy I owed anyone, she said, hand steady around mine. You taught me the second kind. I choose you every day. It isn't automatic, which, since the day you walked into my company with a ledger and no fear of me at all, has been every single day. You stood up for me when nobody else in the room would, I said, and you never once let go after. I choose the same thing back. Every day, on purpose, no contract required. Marcus Teague was serving the second year of a sentence that would run considerably longer once the fraud charges against him were finished stacking. Harold Calder had lost the last of the estate to restitution and hadn't shown his face in Harrow docks since. Dana had moved out of state, and nobody, as far as I knew, missed the sound of her laugh. The bell above Bellwether Bakery's door rang clean and bright the morning of our first anniversary as we stood together behind the counter at sunrise, flour on both our wrists now, because Vesper Corvain, terror of the docks, had turned out to be catastrophically bad at kneading dough and stubbornly determined to learn anyway, burning 2 batches before Wren, laughing so hard she had to sit down. Finally showed her the trick with the oven timer that the coldest woman in the city had somehow never mastered. I used to think being unseen was just the shape of my life, a designation nobody had bothered to properly diagnose, a family that measured my worth in what I could balance for them instead of who I was. I learned, in one impossible 24 hours and everything after it, that being seen was never about being loud enough to demand it. It was about someone finally standing up in a quiet corner of the room and deciding you were worth the risk of speaking. The morning light came in gold through the bakery's front window, catching the small brass fragment on my hand and the new scar on Vesper's shoulder, and the bell still ringing faintly from the last customer's exit. And I understood that every ledger I had ever kept, every quiet column of numbers I had balanced alone in the dark, had only ever been practice for the one thing worth counting. A promise, kept every single day, on purpose. The end.